My name's Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. And I'd like to thank everybody for coming out tonight and joining us for our virtual movie discussion. Tonight, we're looking at the 2016 film Free State of Jones, which was a viewer pick, by the way. Before we get started, I just want to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support, as well as Generac Power Systems. Without those two entities, we would not be able to put on these free virtual programs that we have been doing since 2020 and that we are going to do for as long as they carry out. Everybody seems pretty interested in what we're doing, so we're going to keep on doing that. So yeah, tonight, Free State of Jones, 2016 film directed by Gary Ross, who you might remember from the Hunger Games. And then back in the 80s, he was also the director for the movie Big with Tom Hanks. And then in the early 90s, the movie Dave. Cinematographer for this film was Benoit Delhomme. Not too many films that we would recognize from him. He mostly does his work in Europe. But if you've seen The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, in The Merchant of Venice with Michael Douglas, he did the cinematography for those films. And this film is also starring Matthew McConaughey, who we know from, gosh, I don't know, you name it. There's tons of movies there that he's been in. Dallas Buyers Club and Wolf of Wall Street are the two that come to my mind. And I'm going to hopefully not slaughter these other two actors' names. I'm going to try my best. I looked it up how to pronounce them phonetically. Hopefully I can do it right. The role of Rachel was played by Gugu Mbatha Raw, and the role of Moses was played by Mr. Ali. I'll just say that way. I can't. There's no way I'm going to pronounce his first name. Gugu Mbatha Raw. We saw her in Wrinkle of Time, and I remember her clearly from Cloverfield Paradox. If there's any sci-fi film fans out there, if you do like sci-fi and you have not seen Cloverfield Paradox, I highly recommend it. She's excellent in that, and it's a great film all the way around. And then Mr. Ali, Hunger Games 1 and 2, in which Hunger Games 1, he worked with Gary Ross, the director, and also Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I am not a comic book guy as far as the films go, so I haven't seen any of those. So I don't know what his performance was like in that, but I do remember him from the Hunger Games, and he gets my thumbs up for that and for this movie too. This movie was produced and distributed by STX Entertainment, and the principal photography was done from February 23rd to March 28th of 2015, and it was shot primarily in Louisiana. There were a few inside studio shots that they had that were mostly filmed afterwards, but all their primary filming was filmed in Louisiana. They did want to film in Jones County, Mississippi, but for tax reasons, they decided to go with Louisiana. Got to save some money, especially when I get to this next number here, because this is disappointing. This movie had a budget of $50 million, but it only brought in about $25 million, so it lost about half of its full budget. This seems to be a recurring theme that we're running into recently. Movies that we're reviewing that aren't making money. It didn't start out that way, but the past few films haven't seemed to have done so well in the box office. And particularly with this one, I'm just curious, how hard it is in our modern society to make a Civil War film that kind of attracts all audiences. I mean, we saw that in Glory and we saw that in Dances with Wolves, but I think it's increasingly becoming harder to make a Civil War movie that's going to be marketable to a wide range of people, as opposed to just us history nerds or us cinemaphiles. So yeah, so that's the rundown of the statistics there. Just briefly, what did everybody think of the film? Lisa, you're first up on my lineup, so we'll start with you.
Can you hear me?
Oh yeah.
Okay. I liked it. I liked it a lot. I thought it gave up. I got to go look at some history that I wasn't that familiar with, and I thought it tied and flowed pretty well, and I liked it.
Excellent. Chris, how about you?
Well, I obviously like it because I recommended it. So,
can I recommend something, Chris?
Sure.
Bring back your backwards posters.
Well, I don't want backwards posters. I didn't know they were backwards until you told me.
I really enjoyed them. And the only thing that really backwards was the print. So you always got the nice image. I really enjoyed those, but that's a personal.
Well, I might be able to figure out how to get it so the print is also correct. But I really like this film. One of the things that I noticed at the credits was that Deborah Zane was one of the casting directors on this.
Again,
and just about every movie I've ever seen her as the casting director has always had a great cast. And I thought this had a terrific cast to it. I think every role was played just about to perfection. I didn't really see a flaw in any of the characterizations. So, and the storyline, the historical aspect of it. I don't know if you got a chance to check the supplement that I sent you, Eric.
I completely forgot all about that. You sent it like right after the last movie, and between everything else, I completely forgot to look at it.
Anyway, the Blu-ray had an 18-minute supplement where they interviewed a lot of people, including some descendants of Newt Knight, the author of the book on which the movie was based, some historians, and based on what they said, the movie seems to track pretty well the history of what happened there. So I think overall, as a historical movie out of Hollywood, it probably did as well as any movie I've watched that's based on historical events. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and that's why I recommended it.
Well, we thoroughly, it seems to be anyway. I enjoyed your recommendation. It's probably was not a film that I would have watched, unless for this, this event that we do every month. I like Matthew McConaughey, but I have him framed in my mind in certain roles, and this role wasn't one that I had him framed in. So I just always kind of put it off. But now that I did watch it, I'm glad I did. Thank you for the suggestion, Chris. Franklin, how about you?
Yeah, I liked it. It was a good wrinkle on like the standard Civil War or even war story, being a guy objecting to his own side. I think Matthew McConaughey really threw himself into this role based on a real person. I've been putting off watching it and didn't watch it yet. Until it was chosen for this.
And if I could just say, Franklin, correct me if I'm not mistaken, you were our first place winner in trivia a couple of weeks ago too, weren't you?
Yes, I am.
Well done, well done.
Thank you.
Awesome work. Trivia is not for the faint of heart. So, and then Kent and Kathy, how about you guys? No, you're muted. Sorry.
Hi. We intended to see this in the theater, I guess 2016, and we got down to the final day it was in the theater and something came up and we couldn't go. So we've been eager to see this for a while. And I enjoyed it a lot. And Kent?
I liked it a lot too, yeah. I was intrigued when it was in the theater. I knew enough about it that it was about a county in Mississippi seceding from the Union. And, I used to live in Mississippi. I lived in Mississippi for a couple of years when I was right out of college. And I was just interested in the whole thing. Never got to see it. So I'm glad you kind of forced us to see it by putting it on the list.
Well, everybody can thank Chris for his suggestion. I took movie suggestions. I guess it was summer of last year for movies coming up this year. And Lisa had put out a good suggestion, and so did Chris. So those fell right into our programming. So good job to both of you for some good film suggestions. I liked it as well. I thought it went really, it flowed nicely. The acting, like Chris said, was phenomenal. I didn't see any flaws in the acting at all. The cinematography, I think maybe it was overshadowed by the acting a bit. You have such fine performances from all these actors that you kind of don't notice what Benoit Delhomme is doing. But I thought there were some really rich scenes that he captured, especially with his use of color. And then the directing, Gary Ross, I haven't seen too many films from him. Not films that, stick out of my mind. So it was nice to see or be introduced to a director that really hasn't, got on my radar yet too much. I'll start out with the first question. Oh, wait, I had something else I wanted to mention real quick. Oh yeah, the original director. That's right. I wanted to point this out. The original director was supposed to be a gentleman called Steve Gomer, and he had really only directed one movie before he was considered for directing this, and that was the Barney movie. I can't imagine what this film would have looked like. I'm sure that it wouldn't have been, anything like his directorial debut with the Barney movie. But you just kind of have to imagine maybe what this film might have looked like had it not been directed by Gary Ross and by Steve Gomer instead.
It's weird enough that this was directed by the guy who directed Big. When you said that, I was like, wow, that's. Yeah, and another
and Dave,
kind of
I don't know if you're familiar with Dave, but that's a lighthearted romantic comedy about a guy who lucks into the spot of president because he looks like the president.
Right.
So yeah, to tackle such a serious role or a serious topic, good job for Gary Ross. I thought he did just fine. He actually wrote the screenplay as well, and he said basically what he did was he read for 2 years about this topic, about the characters and all the historical aspects that were behind it during this period of the Civil War with Mississippi ceding, but all these little counties throughout the South that didn't really go along with the whole secession plan. So he really put in his legwork for this. I give him kudos for that. To spend 2 years just doing nothing but pure research. That sounds like a master's degree program to me. The first question I had goes straight to Newton Knight, and really when I asked the first part of this question, I'm looking at maybe like the first 20 minutes of the movie. He certainly defines himself as the role goes along, but in those first 20 minutes, we see, I'm not quite sure what we see from him, and I just asked, what type of man do you think he is? And more specifically, what cause do you think he's fighting for at the beginning of this film?
I just thought that opening scene was so reminiscent of Saving Private Ryan, where it's dirty and gritty and bloody and noisy, and who would want to be in that circumstance? Let's just end this war or find some way out of it. That seemed to be the initial motivation, was just war is hell, and he didn't want to be there.
He seemed to me like to be compassionate, or maybe that's kind of the word I thought of. That these wounded people, he was like, he wanted to save them all. He wanted everybody to come out okay, and had empathy, and I guess compassion was the word I thought of. Not sure it quite hits it on the head, but just that he wanted to save everybody.
Yeah, to the point where he would go so far as to be dishonest. About who he's bringing in, just so he can, maybe move to the head of the line and get the care that he needs. Anybody else want to chime in on that first question?
Well, I thought that the fact that he had almost affirmatively refused to be a soldier and chosen to be a nurse, a medic, was an indication of where his sympathies really lay. They lay with life, not death.
Mm-hmm.
So not necessarily wedded to the cause per se, but to just making sure that people are taken care of as they're going through this horrendous experience.
Yeah.
Lisa, how about you?
I would agree with Chris. At first I couldn't figure out what his cause was, but yeah, he was there. Like he said, like life. He was helping. He wasn't really involved with the battle. I do want to say that the way that they just walk into the shooting or march into the shooting is just I've read about that in history, and I'm just like, seriously, that's just ridiculous. But later on, when they were hiding in the town behind the bags and everything, was like, this is more like it. This is what you do. You hide and you catch people off guard and stuff. Don't just march into being shot down.
And that was Knight's company that was doing that. They came up with the guerrilla tactics that were, effective against the traditional soldiers.
The scenes
Sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say the scenes in Ellisville with the combat were kind of a premonition of urban warfare.
Mhm. That's what I thought.
Yeah, and sorry to say, but that's how a lot of the Civil War was fought. Masses of men on wide open fields. Just if maybe you're marching, two enemies marching toward each other, maybe one's already got a defensive position and the other one wants to take it over. But it was, looking back on it from a modern perspective, actually looking back on it from any perspective, it is insane. And how you can maintain your composure and just keep moving forward as everybody around you is getting mowed down and you haven't even fired a shot yet because you haven't closed that distance. It just makes me happy I was in my tank for Desert Storm. But honestly, that's how warfare had been up until the modern century. I would almost argue all the way up until World War I. That's just how you had to fight it. Once you introduce gunpowder weapons, it maybe made it a little more, I don't know, horrendous, I guess. You can engage from a further distance. You're not actually with a sword or something like that where you have to be 2 feet away. You could be 100 feet away, but still, you have nothing to do but close in on the enemy and try your best. Nowadays, at least you have some sort of sporting chance, I suppose, if that's term can even be used in warfare at all. With modern weaponry and things like that. But yeah, just to watch those people do that. And this movie did not back away from how horrible it was, both in its cinematography, but also in the middle of the film, they had that short segue where they used photographs as well. And those photographs were not shy. They weren't shy about using some gruesome photographs either. That's not typically what you see in a Civil War movie. You'll see, the same picture of Devil's Den at Gettysburg that everybody's seen. But they sure did include the gruesomeness, and they weren't shy about using it at all.
Yeah, I did close my eyes quite a bit. We all know I'm the queasy one here, so.
I'm kind of right there with you, Kent. I can only stand so much human suffering before I have to be like, okay, look over here for a minute, or maybe fast forward it a little bit. But,
yeah, and the lynchings, I couldn't watch any of that either, really, to be honest with you. As terrible as, they probably depicted it as terrible as it actually was, but.
And yeah, to just jump ahead, a little bit into the movie, that scene where they hung Moses and castrated him, basically. That was a difficult scene to watch. It most certainly was. Well, we kind of covered that. I was curious at the beginning of the film. We almost saw identical scenes. The first scene, you see Newt bringing this guy to the field hospital and being able to lie about his rank and get him moved forward in line. But then you have his kin, Daniel, which his role as kin isn't really explained. It turns out that this kid was, I guess, his nephew, although he is a fictional character completely. As Chris said, they did a great job of trying their best to stay historically accurate, but then once you're making a movie as well. So you do have to take some liberties. You have to introduce, some characters to move the story along or to help, shore up the role of the protagonist. So Daniel, it is known that he is not a real character. Maybe he's a composite of some of the actual troops that Newt would have served with. But I was curious, and I said there's like two similar scenes right at the beginning. He brings the soldier in and he gets him saved, but then he tries to save Daniel, ends up getting shot. He brings him to the field hospital as well, but he can't get him saved. And I'm curious if you think maybe he used up his one get out of jail free card, so to speak, with the first soldier. And maybe if he hadn't have done that, do you think maybe he would have been able to save Daniel?
Well, he certainly wasn't going to pass Daniel off as an officer. So he
No,
couldn't.
and that's true.
That
And that was one thing as I was writing this question. I'm like, well, he did look pretty young.
Yeah.
Even if, for a fresh-faced lieutenant, he still looked pretty young. So you're not wrong about that, Kathy, for sure.
I don't think he used up anything. think it wasn't possible with everything that was going on. And
was Daniel just a way for Newt to be able to rationalize his desertion, do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Franklin, did you have something there?
Well, I don't know. He, he wasn't, he didn't like abandon like before the attack. He was, willing to fight until, things got really bad.
Yeah, the first part of the movie, while it wasn't terrible, it kind of raised more questions than it seemed to be answering. And I get that you're supposed to be setting up the rest of the story with this, but I think maybe this is the one point where maybe Gary Ross could have maybe tightened up his directorial skills a little bit, and maybe just tightened up the very beginning of that movie. I mean, he's explaining what kind of person Newt is, and he's explaining maybe why he deserts, but I think it could have just been tightened up a little bit more. Like I said, not that it was a bad first 20 minutes. It just kind of left you with your head cocked a little bit going, how's this going to play out?
But he deserted largely to take his body home, to take Daniel's body home. I mean, I guess that was the turning point that way. He wanted to get him home and get back home. And then he probably at the time said, oh, I'm never coming back, but I at least got to get him home to his kin and so forth. So.
Yeah, and I think maybe that he did have the idea to return back to his unit after he got there. But once he got home, what was it that he saw?
All the people's, everything being stripped from them, their crops and money and everything they had, in his hometown or whatever, in his home. That's got to hit you.
Yeah, for sure.
I thought that the line that kind of captured his attitude was when he was getting ready to take Daniel home, and I think it was Will says to him, he died with honor.
Yeah.
And he says, no, he just died.
Just died.
And I think that really captured what his view of the entire war was at that point, and maybe even before that. In the supplemental stuff that video on the Blu-ray, they talked about what he was actually like based on the research that they'd done, and apparently he was opposed to this whole thing right from the very beginning. He was not a Confederate at any point, but he would. I guess he didn't want to be a deserter. He didn't want to be risked that, so he became a nurse and a medic. And
yeah,
this just pushed him over.
Chris, it's a good point, and I also wrote down another line too. Again, between Will and Newton, and it's right around. I think it's just a couple minutes before he says no, he just died. Will says, I'm not fighting for cotton. I'm fighting for honor. And Newt goes, oh, well, that's good, Will, because I sure would hate to be fighting for cotton. Very sarcastically, just dripping with sarcasm. And that's, I don't know, maybe that's, every soldier's crutch, I suppose, no matter what area you're in, what war you're a part of. At the very least, you can always tell yourself you're doing it for honor, no matter what, the actual cause is. Hopefully you're on the right side, but if you're not, you can always at least say, I'm doing it for honor. I'm doing it for country.
That's the basis of the lost cause too.
Exactly. Yeah. You said something else that reminded me of another note that I had. I'm sure I'll find it here in a second though. Yeah, I'll get to it in a second. After he deserts, and he notices what's happening back home, that people are getting their stuff taken by the Confederacy itself. And this is all, legal by some laws that were passed that allow these commanders, these regional local commanders, to go in and take stuff for the cause itself, regardless of how much it is or when it is. It's all legitimized through these laws that they passed. And we'll talk about some of those laws later on too. But can you pinpoint a particular moment where Newton goes from, I guess, from deserter to rebel?
Was it when he's with those with the little girls and the mom, and she says we're not gonna, that they're clearing everything out, and he kind of bends down and gets some guns for the little girls and says, hey, we're gonna be offense here and not just be stepped on.
It's either that, Lisa, or I'm going to let everybody else go on before I chime in my 2 cents. But that could be one of the moments, absolutely.
As I agree with that. That was definitely I thought that was a turning point also for him. That was one of my favorite scenes, actually, with the little girls. That was just just incredible. But yeah, I'd say that, but agreeing with Lisa.
I was just curious if there was something just a minute or two before that, and it's still all kind of part of the same scene, but when he finds out what's happening, I don't know, maybe I just imagined it, but I just saw this facial expression that just changed in him. You know, when we saw him trying to save people on the battlefield, I don't want to say he had almost a saint-like face. I don't know, maybe it's hard to describe, but when he found out what was going on and he was talking to the people back home, especially this lady who was having her cornmeal stolen, and what else, other cattle and horses. I don't know, it just seemed to me that there was a change in his expression, a change in his face, and it didn't seem like he lost it throughout the rest of the film. He might have put it down in a couple of scenes, but it was just more of an intensity, I thought. But you know, certainly I can't fault anybody for saying it was the scene with the little girls and the guns. And yeah, that was a great scene. It kind of reminded me of The Godfather, when Michael and Enzo were standing on the hospital steps, and you know, the bad guys are coming to kill Vito, and you know, they put up their collar and Michael kind of sticks his hand in his pocket, you know, are you gonna come up here? Those little girls were great. I thought that was a wonderful scene. The note I have is the family that shoots together stays together.
And keeps its corn. That scene you were talking about, Eric, kind of is perhaps the point at which he transforms into what the historians have said he was called at the time, which was the Robin Hood of Jones County. That was when he realized he had to steal from the Confederate thieves and bring it back. And so you see that with the corn shucking later on, and just making sure that people weren't losing what little they had. I thought that the scene with the kids and the mom also showed his creativity when he says, "No, not 4, 8," and then they point up, and it looks like they have the weapons when they're really just the handles of the hose and the rakes and so on. Yeah. But it kind of indicates what kind of a creative leader he could be, and I think was revealed as throughout the rest of the movie.
And then the next question, and absolutely, Chris, and I had actually kind of forgotten about the hoe handles and the rake handles poking out of the top of the barn. Yeah, I thought that was pretty ingenious as well. But do you think his initial actions did more harm than good? You think it brought down more heat on them before they had a chance to actually organize themselves into some sort of rebellion?
Well, if so, maybe that was just licensed by the filmmaker. I'm not sure how that would play out in reality in that circumstance. So it could just be more Hollywoodization of the story.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Franklin.
Knight always seemed to do, what seemed right to his heart at the moment without really having a real long-term plan.
Yeah.
If someone's suffering, it helps them.
What is it? George Clooney says in one of my most favorite movies that I can't think of the title right now, but I will in a minute. But it's a fool that looks for logic in the chambers of a human heart. Fantastic line. And I'll think of the movie in a minute. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it too. But yeah, I would agree, Franklin. He does seem to kind of leap before looking. And I mean, that's a human trait. It's hard to get around. I'm pretty sure that we've all done that at some point or another. Maybe some of us are still doing it. But it's especially when you are saddled with these types of situations, it's hard to not do that. You want to be helpful. You want to, be the Robin Hood figure, like Chris said. And you don't always think about the consequences. You just want to affect a right solution now. And it's hard to say whether you're doing the right thing or not.
One
go
more
ahead, Lisa.
thing. I think that when there's a lot of oppression, that anything that you do that's right, that's against that, is going to cause more turmoil.
Yeah, you're probably right 90% of the time on that, probably higher than that. And the thing I think for Newton was that this wasn't the enemy. This wasn't the Union Army that was coming down. This was his own people. This was the cause that he was, a part of. And maybe mentally still is a little bit, if not physically. So that's almost worse. It's one thing for the enemy to come and do that, or the other, as we've talked about before, but for your own people, for your own cause, to be taking advantage like that, it's got to be a little more of a bitter pill to swallow, and maybe necessitates a little more drastic action, I guess.
Well, I'm wondering whether Newt actually saw them as his people.
Well, and I use that term loosely. You're right. He was, and I do have a note here that he was anti-union, but he wasn't pro-slavery. He wasn't fighting to keep slaves, I don't think. He was fighting, more to, I don't know, honor, I guess. Here we go.
I thought he was fighting for human dignity, basically.
Yeah. Okay, that's better than honor for sure. But he certainly was not, he was not a slave owner. He wasn't a plantation owner. He wasn't a rich man. There was really nothing for him to be fighting for that is associated with what we think of why the Civil War was fought. Human dignity for sure. Helping, and he did serve with a lot of men from his area in his own hometown. So as, or the nurse or the medic on the battlefield, he's certainly trying to help his people, these people that he's probably known his whole life. So he wasn't the pro-slavery guy, I don't think. He never struck me as that.
I thought too, as it went along, I thought he became in that role of like the white savior in a Civil War film.
Yeah.
And I do have that question at the end. Do we want to tackle that now?
Oh, okay. I hadn't looked at the question, so sorry to.
No, you're fine, Kathy. But you're absolutely right. And I did ask that question. Where's it? Oh yeah. Do you think Matthew McConaughey's character is just another example of the white male savior role, or did it become more than that by the time we got to the end of the film?
Well, he was. It started out he was helping white people. I mean, the whole rebellion stemmed from that. It wasn't until he had to hide out in the swamp that he suddenly was. And if he was the compassionate person that I thought he was at the beginning, he had to interact with these, people who were different. And he was able to say to himself, they're getting stripped. They've already been stripped of everything. And they're part of this rebellion also, I think but it possibly took him a little while to do that, to say, well, let's get the whole, let's get everybody in this, including the black people who maybe he hadn't thought too much about before, when the rebellion started with his people.
Who had the most to gain, obviously, because of their low position.
Anybody else got it? Go ahead, Lisa.
I think that it's kind of like in the female agent movie, like they didn't have role. There was a guy there who did it.
Mhm.
But in these times, I mean, you're not really going to have a black guy being able to do everything that they want because the position that they're in. So it's kind of a tricky place to, with that there. I do think they could have integrated the relationships a little bit more. And one scene that stuck out to me that made it feel white savior like was when he headed up Moses's funeral. I was like, I don't know. Maybe that should have been left to his family. I mean, I know he was brother family, but
Mhm.
Mhm.
that stood out to me as being a little much.
Anybody else have a thought on that before we move on?
I think the early scenes in the swamp, he was actually the guy who was being saved
Yeah,
by the black people. And
even
they-
before that,
yeah.
pardon?
even before that,
Even before that, sure.
with the infant who had the fever,
Right,
and Rachel was called, to help with that.
right. But particularly in the swamp, you get the sense that, or I got the sense anyway, that the runaway enslaved people, the small coterie there, kind of looked at him like, you really don't know what's going on, do you?
Yes.
And in fact, when they're dealing with the dog bite, one of them says, you must taste like us.
He chomped on you pretty good.
Yeah. So I didn't see him as the white savior in a white savior role so much. I think I agree with Lisa. I mean, what are you going to do in the Deep South during the Civil War? You're not going to have a Frederick Douglass come up and lead you out of it, and get white and black people to see a common goal. It's going to take somebody like a Newt Knight to sort of meld that force together.
Yeah, I between what you just said and what Lisa said, I think you're absolutely right. It's hard to escape that dynamic. And if you do go outside of it, you don't have the movie that we have. Maybe not even the movie at all. So, while I would love to see some leadership come from somewhere else, it does have to come from a realistic source, I guess, and that is, a realistic source is Newt Knight. Like Chris said, it's not going to be Frederick Douglass. You're not going to have Moses, the slave. You're not going to see him be able to unite both sides to form this rebellion. Newt barely could do it all by himself, or as he was. It did start to fall apart later on, especially with the white people. They got what they wanted, and now they're bowing out. Lisa, sorry, did you have something?
Look what happened when Moses stepped into a leadership role.
Yeah.
The absolute worst thing that could happen. Yeah, for sure.
That's the reality of that's why the role of Newt was what it was, because in reality you just can't during that time period. I mean, he started edging towards that, and they showed him collecting all those signatures and everything, and then within a matter of a little bit of time, he's gone.
I was so mad at that scene too. I just want to flip my table up.
It was awful.
I was like, oh.
Awful.
Well, and I think that the way Knight is portrayed in this movie has historical accuracy to it. I mean, that he did in fact lead people and try to build this at least biracial group to fight for their own rights. I mean, he recognized, I think, that they were all at the bottom of the economic pile, regardless of the color of their skin. And it took a little bit to try to get people to recognize that.
Kind of while we're on the topic of Moses a little bit, I'm curious why Moses declined to have his slave color taken off when he was first met in the swamp by Newt.
Yeah, that was the first I've seen that those might have been a real thing. I thought those colors in Wild Wild West were probably based on it.
Actually, point in fact, the reason I do bring this question up is so I could do a little bit of shameless promotioning for the museum. We do actually have a slave collar on display. It was worn by a slave named Old Steve from Alabama, who made his way across southern lines to Wisconsin troops, Wisconsin 8th Volunteer Infantry, as a matter of fact. And it is one of the first things you see as you walk into our Civil War gallery. It's not quite as terrible as Moses's. It's not super wide with those big spikes pointing out of it. It's more super tight around the neck, almost choking, with 2 metal bars sticking out of the back that stick behind your ears. And when I do this, my ears look enormous, not that they're not enormous already, but it prevented the slave from turning his head at all. And I get to point that out to every single tour that comes through. And it's just, it's absolutely mind-boggling how one human could do something like that to another. And then just below it is a slave whip. And it's not a regular whip like you would see Indiana Jones trying to brandish. It has a very fine leather tip about this long that's angled to a point. The handle has spikes all around it, so in case the slave were to try to grab it out of whoever's using it, try to grab it out of their hands, they would impale their hands on the spikes. And the chain that holds the leather tip at the very end is thick. And just those 2 pieces together are very powerful. And like I said, that's one of the first things you see as you walk into the gallery. So Franklin, those were actually really used all the time on slaves to one degree or another, whether it was like Moses's or whether it was like the one that we have displayed in the museum. But those were real items used by real slave owners to control these people.
Django Unchained.
Yeah, never mind the fact that their hands and feet are chained together. We have to use all these other things too to keep these unfortunate people in line. Let's move on to another topic.
Well, the reason he gave was that he didn't want the noise of having it taken off attract the hunters, and so when he takes it off, the next thing that happens is they're being tracked down by the dogs and the posses.
Yeah, I mean, taking that thing off is going to require some noise, and it's going to alert some people. Somebody's going to hear that, especially when you're talking about the scenario that people are set in the Civil War. You're not, right on top of each other in, neighborhoods like we have nowadays, but still you're close enough. People are going to hear things, especially when it comes to metal being broken. That's not a quiet noise.
Well, and they also recognized that earlier when Newt asked, "Why do you build a fire inside the tree?"
Oh yeah, yep.
Because they'll see it and they'll come.
I forgot about that. And then they used that to the opposite effect later on in the film. I thought that was kind of ingenious of them. We talked about Newt as, whether he's the white male savior or not. We talked about why his role was as important as it was for the time period, for the place that they were at. But I want to talk about real quick about the women's roles that were played in this movie. It's not very often that you see a Civil War film that puts so much emphasis on the importance of women. And in this case, both white and black, particularly with Rachel and his ex-wife. Her name is escaping my memory right now. Does anybody remember his ex-wife's name?
Sabrina or Serena?
Serena, that's what it is, yes. So I'm pretty sure that's what it was, is Serena, yeah. But how can we look at the women that are portrayed in this film?
Well, I think they understood better than probably even the men what was going on, because they often
as
bore
usual, I would say, for women. They're smarter than we are.
Yeah, well, they bore the brunt, much more of the brunt of the war than often even the soldiers, because they had to stay back. They were at risk of, like the Confederate soldiers coming in and taking everything from them. There was nobody there to defend them.
Yeah.
They saw the senselessness of everything that was taking place too. That when they were stripped of their farms and their animals and their goods and everything, it was everything. The soldiers didn't just take what was necessary. They took everything. And so those women, I think eventually, or a bit at a time, had to learn how to defend something. They want to hang on to something.
I thought one
Yeah,
of the
Go ahead, Chris.
I was gonna say, I thought one of the powerful scenes was when the soldiers come in and the woman is, fighting back. It's my cotton. I spun it. That's the stuff I made. You can't take that. And I think that kind of captured what women were suffering at the time, and also provided the motivation for them to join in the battle against it.
Here's
Anybody
sort
else
of-
have a thought on that? Go ahead, Lisa.
Sort of a question. So the women who weren't as wealthy, their husbands were off fighting, so they were alone. Did they get more of the soldiers coming and taking from them than the women or the plantations? Because those people had 20 slaves or 40 slaves and they didn't have to fight. And so the men were there. Were they left alone?
I would have to say yes. It's easy to take from the vulnerable people, and it's much harder to take from people who are maybe more well-resourced or actually have men there to protect them. Like you said, they had the 20 Negro rule, similar to the $300 kind of rule or law that they had up in the North. If you can meet this status, you're exempt from having to go out and fight. So certainly if you had 20 slaves, you could stay home on your plantation with your family. You could defend what you've harvested, what you've done, as opposed to, Newt's family or any other, common family back then that didn't own slaves and was just kind of, subsistence farming. So I would have to say yes to that, Lisa, absolutely. And it's a shame. And then, like I said, in the North, they had the $300 kind of law or rule. If you could pay $300, you got out of the draft. You didn't have to go and serve. But like Leonardo DiCaprio says in Gangs of New York, who has $300? It might as well be $3 million. Nobody has that except for the rich.
Well, I think that $300 rule also led to the draft riots in New York City.
Right, exactly right. Well, one of the reasons, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So as Chris pointed out, there's a space and kind of like more toward the center, the middle of the movie, where we do have these Robin Hood-esque acts. They are stealing from the rich and giving to the poor, so to speak. And as they're becoming more victorious, I did notice that the score, the music, starts to become, you would expect it to be a little happier, a little more victorious, but it becomes more somber and more dead end, I guess. And I was curious, are we being set up for something here? And I do ask the question, if we're being set up for some sort of unexpected tragedy at the end of the film, or do you think that maybe there's another reason that the score doesn't quite match the actions at this point?
I'll go. I think that it's always a step forward and 2 steps back in these types of situations, because you just don't have the power. So you make some headway, and then it starts coming down heavy, almost like areas of Ukraine right now. They make some headway, and then somebody says, oh no, they're making headway, let's throw in these heavy bombs and do this terrible destruction. So maybe that was that ominous sound, because you never really just have a steady incline upwards of victory. It's like just constant, a little bit and then taken back.
I like that analogy a lot, Lisa. I'm actually writing it down. It's a common concept, but you're absolutely right. I absolutely agree. All right, if anybody else wants to chime in? No, it's pretty cut and dry on that. About 3/4 of the way through the film, they start to, like I said, they start to make progress. They start to make headway, and all of a sudden, the white yeomen that are working with them, all of a sudden, they begin to abandon the cause. Why was that? and I'll throw out two options. Was that because they felt that they had succeeded in what they were trying to do, and that was good enough for them? Or do you think that they abandoned the cause because they were afraid of the consequences?
Well, there certainly would be consequences, so that wouldn't be a illogical attitude to have.
I kind of suspect that they knew that the war had been fought for the economically advantaged. And as the war came to an end, I think they realized that with the war over, the economically advantaged were going to be in control again. And therefore, if they continued on their quest for some kind of economic justice, they were just going to be squashed. So better not to risk that retribution.
Mhm.
A survival tactic.
Mhm.
Fight or flight, and they did both. They fought and then they took off. I don't know what the right answer to that is, and I'm nodding to Chris's response, because that's absolutely a viable option. I'm just not sure if they were fleeing because they had did what they had set out to do to a certain point, or if because they were scared to get killed. A couple of them do come back. Will comes back, right? If I'm not mistaken. I had to rent this movie. This was not one that was in my usual lineup on all the channels that I get. So I only got a chance to watch it twice, and that was about 2 weeks ago. And I've probably seen about 12 movies since then. So I'm trying to remember bits and pieces and through my notes and whatnot. What is, and then I actually, so the war ends, and we see, God, this ending just really, once again, it tore me up. It made me want to flip my table over. It got me really mad. How do these Southern slave owners skirt federal laws to reinstitute slavery by apprenticeships and then start stealing people and saying, oh, it's our apprentice? How could they get away with that?
Well, and what they did with the voting rights, I mean, it's just so contemporary.
yeah.
It's so contemporary.
Two people voted for the Democrats in that in that election, and 319 or whatever for the Republicans, and 319 for the whatever the other side was called.
Yeah, what does he say? We don't have any Republican ballots.
Yeah.
We
Right.
just don't have any.
Yeah.
You better find some, Newt says. But I was so frustrated with this movie at that point. I mean, I know that this is really what happened. You could find historical examples of it left and right, but just to see it visualized on film and then see how it affects people and see that they're doing it to little kids. It was just so frustrating to watch that.
And the way they used the montage with the photographs of the time and stuff, and then they'd superimpose the, what was going on over that. I thought that was really effective, cool way to present that. And you'd said, yeah, well, it really happened. I mean, it gave you that historical sort of feel. Yeah, this is how it went down.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the great things about films is that you can read about this stuff all day long, but until you see it, visualized, it really, I don't know. I don't think it strikes you as much until you see it happening, and it's not really happening. These are actors portraying these events, but just to see it played out in front of you as opposed to just reading some words in a book, I think it takes on a different feel, and it evokes different emotions.
Yeah, it's sort of like reading about Bloody Sunday on the Pettus Bridge. You can read the stories, but then you see the scene played out in the movie Selma, and it has a much bigger impact on you.
Yeah. My master's thesis was on resistance in Nazi concentration camps, and you could read about all that all day long, but until you actually go to a concentration camp and walk the grounds and walk into the crematoriums and smell the smell that's still there, it's not the same. You just really can't get a good grip on it.
Yeah, the theory and practice of hell.
Yeah. I do. We are starting to run out of time. There is one thing, the big elephant in the room that I want to bring up that I haven't got to yet. What did everybody think about the forward flashing to the courtroom scene in the 1940s, interspersed throughout this film?
Well,
I
again,
liked it. Oh,
it brings it up to modern times, you know? Go ahead. I'm sorry, Chris.
well, I was just going to say, I liked it because it showed the long tail of this of these events. How many years later it was still affecting and infecting the lives of people in that area.
And I think
Go ahead,
right
Lisa.
now, I think right now there's something about people trying to do legislation on marriages. So when you're
Yes,
talking about the long
unfortunately,
tail,
this
Chris,
conversation is still taking place in our
long-
legislative
the
halls.
long tail is still whipping around.
Yeah, there's a question now about whether this should be a states' rights thing or a federal law. And there's more to it than that. And it's like, this is 2022. How are we still having this conversation? Why is this even a topic today? But those courtroom scenes, the first one they showed, I just had to pause the movie and I was like, wait, what is going on here?
Yeah.
I was really getting into it. And then you do this. That first time that they made that forward jump, I was really put out. I did not like it. But once you finish the film and you see why it's in there, Chris is exactly right. It's to bring everything full circle, to show you that Davis Knight, who was a real person, who really did have to go to court for miscegenation laws, for being 1/8 Negro and marrying a white woman, that really happened in the 40s. And just like the movie says, they were going to put him in jail for that. They did find him guilty, and they were going to prosecute him to the full extent of the law. What that meant, though, for Mississippi state courts was that he was going to probably appeal that to the Supreme Court, which would knock it down. And then the Supreme Court would start eyeballing Mississippi law. And they didn't want Supreme Court to be eyeballing Mississippi law to take away these sorts of entitlements that they had put in, or entitlements isn't the right word, but you know what I mean. So it's maddening that this was all real. And Chris's summation of it, like he said, to bring it full circle, to show that that in the 1940s, as World War II is raging, that we're still dealing with this sort of thing. And then Lisa, fantastic point to bring it up, that this is in the news this week, headlines all week long, from some of our elected officials. So
When I read the summary of why the Mississippi Supreme Court overturned the conviction, I just had to laugh, because they basically said, oh, there wasn't enough evidence. and there was more evidence than you could possibly imagine to convict him of that. So it was clearly that the Mississippi Supreme Court was saying, we cannot afford to have anybody else look at this stuff.
Yeah.
In the film, the prosecutor said, I've never had more clear evidence in my entire career.
Right.
What we have right here, this family Bible.
Right. And then the Supreme Court basically says, oh, not enough.
We have 1 minute left. I want to just ask briefly, I want to talk about the actors. I don't think I'm going to get to too many points of the film, especially the cinematography, which is a bummer. You guys know how much I like cinematography. We did talk a little bit about taking our artistic license with historical facts. I haven't asked that question before. Maybe I should have asked it in a different movie where there was more license taken. Like Chris pointed out, it wasn't a whole lot taken in this film. It pretty much stayed along its historical narrative as it played out in real life. A few minor, offshoots here and there, but for the most part, a lot of the other movies that we've watched have taken far more liberties, that's for sure. But the actors themselves, first of all, how long did it take everybody to get used to Matthew McConaughey's accent? It took me about 15-20 minutes. I couldn't understand a thing he was saying for the first
Yeah.
little bit of that movie.
Huh.
Yeah. Yeah,
And I don't know if
I-
maybe I just got used to it or if he toned it down as it went on, but
No, there were a couple places in the movie that I had to back up and listen to 2 or 3 times, and I still don't know what was said.
Huh.
That's kind of why I played it with subtitles.
ah. Oh, that drives me nuts though, Chris. I end up paying more attention to reading than I do at looking at the visuals. And next thing you know, I've missed half of the movie because I'm reading it.
The first time I saw it, I didn't see subtitles. The second time I watched it, I decided to put the subtitles on.
But Eric, you
course-
said this was, I'm sorry, this was filmed over basically the span of 1 month. So if he had a dialect coach, that would have, the dialect would have been pretty consistent over the span of a month.
Yeah, and sometimes the director will give some sort of guidance as to, hey, you set your character up really well as being from this locale or that locale, through not only your mannerisms and your dress, but also your accent. But now that you've established that, let's back off a little bit. I don't know, I can't say for sure that that's what happened, or if maybe our ears just became attuned to it. I don't know one way or the other. All I know is that the first 15 minutes of that movie, I was really struggling to understand what he was saying. And maybe that's a credit to his acting ability. Matthew McConaughey did not come from any sort of acting background, and to achieve what he's done in film, I think is pretty phenomenal. Just by lucking onto a seriously silly part in Dazed and Confused, which was his first role. He just happened to stumble on that role, and he's parlayed it into a fine acting career, I think. So, like I said, maybe that's a credit to his acting abilities as well. Last question. Everybody knows what it's going to be. Who's your favorite character and why? We'll start at the far end, and we'll start with Kathy. We'll move to Kent.
Okay, I would say Moses. He was just so central to the story. And like you said, he was complex and complicated with the issue of the device on his neck, and just his leadership. And I thought it was really his story in a lot of ways.
That's an interesting take, and I like that take though.
Yeah,
Very,
ditto.
very much so.
I was going to say Moses too, and then of course he became the martyr of the movie. So yeah, Moses.
Franklin, how about you?
I'll say the villain, that Confederate officer that was hunting him the whole time and got his comeuppance.
Major Elias Hood. Yes.
Yeah, that was some
sorry,
great acting.
Colonel Elias Hood. He was based on a real character that they can almost pretty much guarantee Newt Knight did shoot, but they don't have definitive evidence of that. But that character was based on a guy named Major Amos Mecklemore. That was the real person that was, the real sheriff of Nottingham type of character here. So yeah, okay, excellent. Chris?
It was really hard to choose because all the characters were so well defined, I thought. But it was kind of a tie for me between Rachel and Davis Knight. And even though Davis Knight only comes up a little bit, I liked him because, as I said before, he kind of brought the pain of that era into the modern era and showed that connection. I thought he did a really good job of doing that, particularly when he says, "No, I'm not going to do the plea like you thought I was going to. I'm in love with my wife, and I'm not going to plead guilty to something I don't think I'm guilty of." And of course, and I think Rachel really captured. There was something about her that really just kind of grabbed me. I think it was basically mainly her courage, I think, in the face of everything she was facing. Plus, she was a real character as well.
Yeah. Lisa?
I would have to go with Rachel because she really she was very strong. She went beyond herself to try to read. She endured that horrendous stuff from the plantation owner, and then taking in his ex-wife. Oh my gosh. what a strong woman. And the child.
Mhm.
My favorite character was Rachel as well. Not only did, like both you and Chris, I found her very courageous, very strong, but on the opposite end, I also found her softness and her compassion, and not by what you said, Lisa, by taking in, his ex-wife and his kids. I thought throughout the whole movie, she just exuded this very soft nature. And it was such a contrast to everything else that we were seeing in the film, not only visually, but also through the other character traits too. And I just thought she really stood out as like this grounding almost. No matter how mad the movie made you by what was going on or how sad you were, there was always Rachel right there in the middle that just kind of brought you back to I don't want to say reality, because reality sucked for them. But it just, I don't know, it just made it seem more palatable, and just like, and a softness keeps coming to mind. She just had this softness to her. While she was tough and she was courageous, she just had that certain je ne sais quoi that just made me feel good every time that she was on the screen. Nothing could go wrong while she was there, and if it did, she was going to help take care of it.
She was kind of like iron wrapped in velvet.
That might be a little better description. It certainly fits with what I'm thinking, Chris, for sure. All right, so everybody, thank you so much for joining us tonight for Free State of Jones. If I'm not mistaken, and I know somebody will correct me, next month is Men at War. Yes.
Oh,
No, okay.
So,
I think it is Men at War, a Korean War movie, black and white, starring Hayden Christensen keeps coming to mind because I just watched Star Wars the other night. It's not Hayden Christensen, from Dr. Strangelove, the crazy Air Force Base commander, Hayden.
oh, Sterling Hayden.
Sterling Hayden, yes, thank you very much. Starring Sterling Hayden. I did get a chance to watch this movie about a month and a half ago. I just happened upon it late one Saturday night, and I was like, oh, this is going to be coming up in our rotation. Let me watch this. And I got to say, I was uniquely impressed with the film. It's a different type of film. It's shot differently. The acting is fantastic, but I think the storyline carries everything through. So as you're watching this over the next few weeks, I hope you enjoyed as much as I did, and I definitely look forward to talking about it next month. I hope everybody has a great weekend.